evening,
evening,
everybody. We welcome Professor Garoupa for the final session of this course.
Thank you
It's all
all.
yours, Professor.
Thank you. So as I said yesterday, unfortunately, I do have another conference call in 2 hours. So I'll finish before that. The bad news is there won't be any break. So I'm sorry about that. We'll try to finish about 10 minutes before the time. So my plan is to go over some of the topics. Particularly, I want to focus on the early chapters of Bob Cooter's book, which has been circulated. The reason is because I think these are the most important chapters. And then, of course, as usual, any questions are welcome. Otherwise, when I'm done, I will open for more general, policy and more general questions. Okay, so remember, essentially, in the last session, we have been talking about constitutional law and economics. And as I explained yesterday, this is a less well-defined field compared to criminal law and economics, or property or contracts or tort. It's a sort of an assemble of different topics. That in fact, when I was asked to talk about constitutional law and economics, there's no clear book that we can use. I mean, Bob Cooter's book is, in my view, the best approach, but it's very incomplete, of course, and by now, sort of, the later chapters are a bit outdated because there's been more research. And if you notice, those of you who have looked at about the Bob Cooter and Hewlin's book, which I think it's also been circulated. It's the 6th edition is online anyway, because Cooter and Hewlin did something very nice to all of us. They bought back their copyrights from the publisher so that the book can be freely accessible online for everyone. Of course, this is good for the students because you don't have to buy the book. I'm an old man, so I still like to have hard copies. I like to read my books in hard copy version. But for the young generation, I guess PDFs are just fine, and so the book is available online as a PDF copy. Now, if you look at the book, there's no chapter on constitutional law, right? I mean, you look at the book of Cooter and Hewlin, there's no chapter. If you pick any more advanced book like Chevel's Fundamentals of Economic Analysis of Law, which I recommend for more advanced students because it's a more difficult book to read, more mathematical. That book also has no chapter on constitutional law and economics. But even if you prefer to read the old Posner, I think Posner 6 or 7 edition is available. Again, there's no chapter on constitutional law and economics. So that's to say that why this field is a little bit less sort of structured and easily available out there. Now, one issue that I tried to emphasize yesterday is we're trying to look at the way we structure and organize our country, our politics, through the lens of economics. And one of the approaches, which has limitations, I'll say in a moment, is to think that in a democracy, citizens, potential voters, are just like consumers, right? And so the general idea is that you have a supply, which is the politicians, the parties. They offer you a bundle of goods and services in terms of their political platforms. And when you vote, it's like you're acquiring that particular platform. Now, this is not, if you go back to the 1950s. Those of you who have done sort of the foundations of public choice and the foundations of rational choice theory in political science know that I'm referring to the traditional Downs model. For those of you who are not familiar with the Downs model, the Anthony Downs model, it's sort of an application of the Hotelling model, right? Remember, Hotelling is the linear city where you have a distribution of distance and you have to choose where to locate your firm, right? And when you have two firms, the solution is that each firm should be located next to each other in order to get 50% of the market. Unless you have some, peculiarities with the distribution of preferences and something like that. But essentially, if you have a normal distribution of preferences, where you have a medium preference, you know that in the Hotelling model, the firms will locate next to the medium, right? Because that way each firm has 50%. And if you studied industrial organization, you know when you have three firms, that's when the equilibrium becomes a problem, right? It's the different concepts of equilibria for the Hotelling model when you have three firms. If you have one firm, it's a monopoly, it will take the entire market. If it's two firms, a duopoly, they will locate to each other in order to get 50% of the market. Of course, when you have three firms, you have to make some additional assumptions to get the Nash equilibrium. Might be a sequential game. You might need some, whatever other assumption you need to get a stable equilibrium. Well, what Anthony Downs did was apply the Hotelling model to voting behavior. And so this is sort of the canonical result that, politicians always believe, that if you have two parties, like in the United States, and to some extent traditional in the UK, although, as you know, the UK, in fact, always had three parties, not two, but most people always think of the UK as, Labour, Conservative, and forget about the Liberal Party. But what the result it has is that the parties will converge to the center, will converge to the medium voter. And it's the same logic as the Hotelling model. You have a distribution of voters, distribution of consumers, and if you have a normal distribution, you know that 50% is where the medium is, which is sort of the average consumer, the average voter. And so what you end up is both parties converge to the center, right? And this has become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The politicians actually believe the Downs model. And once they believe the Downs model, parties tend to converge to the center. Now, what we are observing now is, of course, things get way more trickier when you have A, multiple parties, B, when preferences do not have a normal distribution, right? If you think that it's possible, it's not clear. It's not clear. There are different views on this. But it is possible that in the United States, what we have right now is a bimodal distribution. That is, you have a lot of people on the right and a lot of people on the left, and very few people in the center. Then, of course, the median becomes an issue because it's not a normal distribution. It's not a bimodal distribution. And the Downs model is sort of a problematic. Okay, this is sort of the background. So what do we do in law and economics? What does Bob Kutter talk about? Well, his argument is we need some mechanism to aggregate preferences, right? So in the very simplistic Downs model, you just vote for the president. And because of the normal distribution, the two candidates will be in the center. And so one candidate will get 50% plus one, and one other candidate will get 50% minus one. And so his argument is that we all converge to the center. Now, the first problem with this model, and that's sort of the first chapter in Bob Kutter's book, is you need to explain why people vote in the first place. Right? I mean, we are assuming that people go out there and they vote. Now, that's like saying, why do people go to a grocery shop and do shopping? Why do we shop online? Why do we go to a lawyer? Why do we acquire goods and services? Well, you know, the answer to that question, every economist in this room knows. It's because your willingness to pay is above the price. It's above the market price, which ideally it's the marginal cost. So in our neoclassical model of supply and demand, we know that people are out there buying goods and services when their willingness to pay is above the marginal cost. And we call that difference, in fact, the consumer surplus. And we have all these theories on how we want to maximize that consumer surplus. And that's why we need all those antitrust laws and competition laws and regulations, because we are out there in the world trying to maximize the surplus. Now, what is this stuff when you go to the political market? What is that willingness to pay? And what is this sort of marginal cost? And that's where we get in trouble as economists. Because the basic notion would be, well, clearly it has to be that people vote when their willingness to vote, that is their marginal benefit of voting, is higher than their marginal cost of voting. Well, the marginal cost of voting is easy to understand. It's the time you spend in line to get your ballot into the box, or you know, in places where you vote in meetings, it's the time you spend on a meeting before you vote, or in systems where you're online, it's the time you have to, you know, check in, put your password, put your identification and vote. Okay, the marginal cost is very trivial. It's the cost of voting. The problem we have is with the marginal benefit, right? Because the marginal benefit in the most neoclassical sense would be, what is the importance of your vote in the election, right? If you vote, you count. If you don't vote, you don't count. So it has to be that your marginal benefit of voting is to actually vote because your vote counts. Now, here's my question. When you vote in an Indian election to the Indian parliament, what do you think is the probability of your voting or individual voting matter for the composition of the parliament? How much does your vote change the composition of the Indian parliament when you vote? Come on, guys. How much does the Indian parliament changes because of your vote, of your individual vote? Now you know the answer. If you stay home, yes, not negligible. You can go more than that. It's zero. I'm afraid if you didn't know that, that's not clearly stated in this class. Your vote has zero impact on the Indian parliament. Now, that's the problem. Exactly what the question is saying. We have two problems. One is to explain why people vote when in fact your vote does not matter for the outcome of the election. And second, how do we address this collective action problem? Because if everyone were an economist taking this class, if billions of people in India are taking this class and learn that their vote counts zero, next election nobody votes. And so we have a very serious problem. So we have two issues. One, to explain why people actually vote. And second, how do we don't get into the collective action trap that everyone is very smart and very rational and says, my vote doesn't count, so why should I care? I won't go there. And then next election, you have zero votes. So the first problem has been a big issue for economists, right? So a lot of political scientists and sociologists are concerned to explain why some people stay home. For the economists, our puzzle is, why do people show up? And don't worry, I do show up on elections. So I'm an economist, I teach this stuff, and I still vote. Yes, according to my model, I'm stupid, but that's how I do it. I still go there, and my vote is there, even though I know my vote doesn't count at all. But that's the thing. right? I mean, from a pure neoclassical economic model, you have a huge puzzle for why people actually vote. And this is very important because remember what we said yesterday, we're talking about aggregating preferences. Now, we need people to vote in order to aggregate preferences, because if people don't vote, we cannot even aggregate preferences because we don't know the preferences of these individuals. So we need to explain why people vote. Now, one cheating explanation, which some economists made in the 70s and the 80s, is cheating in my view because, you know, it just gets one step back. It's, oh, we are all very altruistic about our democracy, and that's why we vote. Well, if that's the case, why are we altruistic about our democracy, right? I mean, if your explanation is, oh, there's some psychological marginal benefit out there that we actually vote because we are all very altruistic, then the question is, where is this altruism coming from? And why are we altruistic for voting and we're not altruistic for other things, right? So that's not a very powerful explanation. A second possible explanation is it's part of our social norms, right? It's part of your role as a good citizen. But in order for this to be clear, there has to be some form of social pressure. And we have some evidence that that could be part of the explanation. So we have a few experiments in Switzerland and in California where people think that when you introduce voting by mail, is that allowed in India? Can you vote by mail? Or you have to be physically there? No. So in Switzerland, they changed the law at some point and they allowed people to vote by mail. And something very interesting happened. For the big cities like Zurich or Geneva or Bern, participation increased. Well, the explanation is simple. Transaction costs have been reduced, obviously, because you can vote by mail. So your cost of voting has been decreased. So you would expect more people to vote. Yes. So that happened in big cities. But in small communities, you actually had the opposite effect. That is, participation went down. Why did participation went down? And that's the social pressure argument. Because in small communities, if you did not show up in the day of voting, people would think you're not a good member of the community. Now, when you vote by mail, when that's possible now, people don't know if you're not showing up because you're not voting or because you already voted by mail. And so the social sort of community norm really generated this very strange result that in small communities, participation by mail actually led to lower participation. That is, few people showing up at the ballot box and fewer people voting. So we need to sort of, yes, but this is not about internet or electronic devices. Of course, there's that issue when you introduce electronic devices. This is just mail, regular mail. You just go to the mail post and you put your vote there the month before the election. So that's not the problem of internet. Yes, there has been studies about the impact of internet voting, but internet voting raises a second concern. It's the extent to which people trust internet voting. Many people think that internet voting can be manipulated, can be changed, and that's why they do not want to use internet voting. That's a different problem, likely to be a generational problem. It's very likely that the younger generations trust more internet voting than the older generations. But there's another issue there. So the studies are a little bit more difficult to interpret because you have the problem of people relying on the internet system, and you need that, you know, micro surveys to try to understand if people really trust the system or not. But okay, so we have a problem in terms of using rational choice theory to explain why people vote. So we need some sort of mechanism to explain why people do not just do the strict cost-benefit analysis by which they would not really participate in an election. And I hope all of you, as I do, try to participate as much as in elections, because I think, you know, I value democracy. I think a lot of people value democracy, and we know that democracy can only work if everyone participates. But that's the first step in our model, because if we want to aggregate preferences, we need to understand why people actually vote in those elections. And so if you go over the first chapter of the book, you can see explanations for individual voting, how to vote, the self-interest model or the public interest model. Related to this, there's a second problem, which is, who are you going to vote for? And this is an information problem. That is, should you spend time gathering information about the candidates? Now, many people, for example, always vote for the same party, no matter what, right? I think in India, it's the same. A lot of people vote for the same party, and then you have a minority of the voters that actually swings parties. And that's the minority that decides the election. A lot of people spend all their life, you know, in the US, about 80% of the voters always vote either Republican or Democrat. Now, we could say that's not logical, that's not rational. Yes, it could be rational in the sense that the costs of acquiring information are extremely high. And if you think that the parties are a proxy of that information, and you think that whatever the Republicans defend or whatever the Democrats defend is always closer to your preferences, then the marginal benefit of acquiring information is probably lower than the marginal cost. Do you really want to spend time listening to all those discussions and reading all the platforms and evaluating all the candidates throughout the country? Maybe not. And so you do a simplistic heuristic. You think you defend a certain core values or core policies. You think a particular party reflects your core values, and you vote for them, no matter what. Now, this leads to another conclusion, which is the voters who actually change votes, the swing voters, are likely to be more informed about policies than the voters who always vote for the same party. Not because they're smarter, but because the benefit cost analysis is simply different. That is, if I am a sort of a middle ground person and I don't really like the Republicans or the Democrats, but I want to vote, I may actually need to have some more information to make up my mind. Now, the supply side, the parties also know that. So they actually build their platforms, what we call in economic language, the bundling of their proposals, in ways to attract these medium voters. Because they know that people, the other people, will either vote for them all the time or never vote for them all the time. Notice that's why, particularly in the US, I don't know right now in India, the way we understand voting has changed in these 30 years. We now are convinced that the real outcome of an election depends on your ability to mobilize voters, right? To get your votes on the ballot box. So that's why a lot of this bundling is now, as we know, polarizing emotional bundling. Most of the time, parties are not saying, I have the best policies, I have the right policies, my policies are good. Most of the time now, I guess, I don't believe India is so different, so it must be the same in India. A lot of these politicians now spend time saying the other party is the devil, the other party is very bad, the other party is awful, the policies of the other party are destructive. Because right now, that's what appeals to sort of get the votes out there. This is very sad in a way, because we are becoming much more emotional rather than rational democracies. And of course, it's sad for us economists because we like rational decisions. We do not like emotional decisions. We would like people to vote because they really want to buy oranges. We would like people to vote because they want to buy cars, not because they hate trucks or because they hate apples. That's not the way we would like a market to operate. It would be a much more positive, in as much as when you go to the supermarket, you don't decide to buy oranges because you hate apples. You buy oranges because you like oranges. Or when you go and buy a bicycle, it's not because you hate cars, it's because you like bicycles. Unfortunately, the market for voting is become a sort of a negative market. You vote against the other side. This is quite problematic, and this is not a political science seminar, so we're not going to explore, the problems that creates. But you can see from our law economics point of view the problems this creates, because you're aggregating, negative preferences. You're not aggregating, the revealed preference, which technically that's what you do when you do economic analysis. You're aggregating revealed preferences, positive revealed preferences. People want to buy goods and services, not like people hate goods and services, and we are aggregating this hateful motivation. So this is quite important, and as you can see, the book gets into this issue of what we call rational ignorance. The idea that most voters vote being ignorant, but rationally ignorant. If I always vote for the same party, it's particularly rational not to know what the party stands for in many areas, in many of the bundling, because I just don't care. I always vote for them. So voters have rational ignorance. Now, this is going to be an issue for the second part of the book, what I mentioned yesterday. Remember, if voters are rational ignorant, then there is going to be asymmetric information between the voters and the politicians. And if there's going to be asymmetric information, we'll have principal agent problems, as we discussed yesterday. So we start seeing where things become sort of problematic. We're saying it's rationally to be ignorant about the policies, because there's a cost to know about these policies, but there's not real any benefit if I always vote for the same party. But at the same time, if I'm rationally ignorant, I cannot punish the party. I cannot punish the bad politicians because I simply don't have the information. I don't look for the information. I don't search for the information that would basically make the principal agent issue less pronounced. So that's part of the problem. On one hand, we can explain rational ignorance, but on the other hand, we see the consequences of that rational ignorance in terms of the agency costs created between the principal, the voters, and the agent, the politicians. So everything is sort of related. And of course, you could argue, well, social media has lowered this rational ignorance, right? Because if you are on social media, there's a lot of information out there, so you can get this information quite easily. Well, the role of social media is also problematic. Yes, you can get a lot of information now very easily. You just need to Google, you just need to go on Twitter. If you want to know what Trump said yesterday, you don't need to buy the newspapers anymore. You don't need to sort of talk to smart people. You just go online and it's there. And if you want to see a video of some stupid politician, you can just go online and see the video. You don't need to, watch TV or wait for the newspaper or the radio to explain you. So in a way, yes, information costs are going down, and you would expect voters to be well more informed than they were 50 years ago. But the problem, as you know, is also how you acquire this information. And the problem is the biased information and the way we actually have a tendency to want information that confirms our bias, right? Most people, as you can imagine, are not big fans as economists, as we are, and we should be, of Bayesian updating, right? Everybody knows what's Bayesian updating, right? Is when you have a prior and then you acquire new information and you should update your beliefs about what's going on based on the new information. And there's the Bayes rule, as you know from statistics, that helps you making your updates rationally, right? So if you believe it's raining and the information that you get is that it's sunny, then by Bayesian update, you should sort of include in your new beliefs that maybe it's not raining because you have an observation that it's sunny, right? So you compile observations and you start moving away from your prior beliefs in a statistical way. Unfortunately, most people don't do that. Most people actually do the other way around. That is, if I believe it's raining, I only want to get observations that is raining. And if you tell me it's sunny, then I'll say you're a big liar because it's not sunny, it's raining. So what you want is a self-enforcing bias. You want information that confirms your prior, and you reject information that does not confirm your prior. This is not Bayesian update. This is not rational behavior. But unfortunately, many people do that. I have to say, personally, I'm very guilty of that, even with some of my students. Right? When some of my students, and I think they're very smart, and then they have a bad exam, I do not update my beliefs, and I still think they're very smart, and they just had bad luck with the exam. So that means I am not doing Bayesian updates. I'm still believing my prior. You're smart, you just had bad luck. When in fact, I could be thinking you're not that smart, and that's why you had a bad exam. But no, I reject the rational updating. I do the emotional updating. No, you're still very smart. You just had bad luck at the exam. Let's try again. Of course, if you have 10 bad exams, at that point, I'm going to start thinking, well, maybe there's something else going on here, because the probability that you're smart and you have 10 bad exams, wow, that's starting to be sort of a big challenge to my rationality. But I think a lot of people, I think you understand what I'm trying to say. A lot of people manage information not from a Bayesian rational point of view, but from an emotional, an heuristic point of view. That is, you tend to disregard information that does not fit your prior and to confirm information that gets to your prior. And if that's the case, then social media becomes an issue. Yes, people are less ignorant, but does not mean that people are getting better information in terms of understanding what's going on. Right? I mean, it's a bit like if you think about, and I always have this discussion with my students. In the US, you have to be careful about these things, because you may actually have people in class that think the planet is flat. As you know, in the US, there's some community that thinks the planet is flat and that we all have been lying for centuries. But I think everyone in this class knows the planet is not flat. Now, what does your intuition tell you, right? when you fly, even in a plane, do you feel the planet is not flat? Don't you feel it's flat? That you're just going from one point to another? I mean, that's my intuition. The planet is flat. My intuition tells me the planet is flat. Now, I know my intuition is wrong because I look at science and I know the science has shown me this is not flat. But if I behave emotionally, what I'll be doing is using my intuition, my feelings, rather than science, to update my beliefs. And therefore, I still believe after all these years, I should believe that the planet is flat, because when I go from Washington, D.C. to Delhi and take my flights, I guess I have to stop in Frankfurt or something like that. I still think this is flat, flat from DC to Frankfurt, flat from Frankfurt to Delhi. I don't see where is this big, round ball. It's flat. When I go from here to Brazil, it's an 11-hour flight, and I do that quite often. It's flat. My sense is I got on a plane in DC, I got out in Rio, 11 hours on a plane, completely flat. It's a line. That's it. So that shows you that your intuitions and your emotions can actually trick your rational updates. Yes, I mean, I think that's a very good question. I mean, can we compare political systems in terms of rational electoral behavior? Not completely sure if we can do that. And here's why. A lot of explanations for voting behavior by political scientists are ex post rationalizations, right? Why did people vote? Again, let's going back to the most striking example ever. Why did people vote for Hitler in 1933? And we come up with a lot of ex post rationalization. Oh, because people were afraid of the hyperinflation. Oh, it's because people didn't know what Hitler was going to do. Footnote, he wrote a book saying what he wanted to do. How come people didn't know what he wanted to do? He explained what he was going to do. Oh, it's because people were threatened by, the Nazi party, and many people were subject to violence. Correct. But the 1933 elections were not especially more violent than the 1930 election or than the 1932 election. And then people did not vote so massively for the Nazi party. Oh, it's because people had their mind made up by the propaganda. Of course, propaganda matters because it's, as we're saying, it's information and people are misinformed. But again, propaganda has always been there. And if you think people believe the Nazi propaganda, there has to be some willingness to believe that propaganda, right? I mean, you can't just blame the supply side. It's like when you say you believed a certain commercial about a certain product. Of course, they produced the commercial, but the consumer has some willingness to believe that particular commercial, and that's why he bought that product. So when we see commercials saying cell phones make my life easier, and I go and buy a cell phone because I think my life is easier with a cell phone, of course I have some willingness to believe that sort of propaganda, which goes back to the discussion we had yesterday about credence goods and how much we know about the quality of the goods. So we have a lot of ex post rationalizations. I think it's very difficult then to compare, because every single situation you come up with ex post rationalizations. And once you come up with ex post rationalizations, any election is pretty rational because you have a rational explanation always for what happened. The issue is really that what happened? Were those the reasons why people actually did vote for that particular outcome? It's always doubtful. And again, remember, we do not have counterfactuals. We do not have exercises where we could say, let's suppose that there was no propaganda. Let's suppose that there was no hyperinflation. Now, how would people vote in this election? Right. So I think comparing rational electoral behavior is going to be very hard, because a lot of what you observe, expose, tends to be rationalized by social scientists anyway. And so it's not going to be hard. It's going to be hard to sort of make a distinction between, actual behavior and exposed rationalizations of that behavior. This goes into, remember, a deep discussion in economics, when psychologists and behavioralists started saying economists are wrong because humans are not rational, and all their theories in economics are based on rational choice theory, and that's not how people behave. And we answered, for a long time, our response was, oh, no. We're not saying everyone is rational. We're just saying people behave as if they're rational. Now, if you believe the as if explanation, then it becomes an issue, because any behavior can be understood as rational within the as if paradigm. And within the as if paradigm, then everyone is rational, and you can't really make any meaningful comparison. So I hope I answered your question. It led me into a deter about rational behavior. Okay, so now let's assume now that we understand how people vote, and we understand rational ignorance, and we understand participation in an election. The next step in our discussion, and if you go to part 2 of this chapter, you will see that Kutter talks about aggregating voters, right? So we need now to aggregate these votes. And of course, there are different ways to do this. I mean, immediately, if you think about, you can have a system where the winner takes all, right? So you aggregate preferences, and the winner takes all the policies. That's the presidential system. But you can also have a system where we're going to give different platforms different quotas of power. That's proportional representation. That's sort of the parliamentary system. We have different parties, according to their percentages, get different seats. These are 2 different mechanisms of aggregating preferences. One is a majoritarian system. The winner takes all, the minority loses and has no influence on policy making. Another system is a proportional system. Of course, with the proportional system, the problem is you will need some sort of bargaining. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages of these models, as you know. No one can say one system is better than the other. They do require different concerns. If you live in a majoritarian system where the winner takes all, of course, your concern is about the minority. You need to make sure that the majority is not going to expropriate rents from the minority. That would be a very bad outcome of aggregating preferences. That is, the winner goes to the loser and says, bad luck, but now I am going to use my majority to expropriate you from any rents. And we have seen experiences, to a large extent about that. As you know, one very hot topic in the United States, very difficult topic, is slavery. But slavery is an example where the ruling party, so although technically the whites were a minority in terms of numbers, but because they control political power, so they are the majority, they expropriated the minority from their human rights. They enslaved them and used them to work for them. That is, they extracted rents from labor because they were not paying the marginal productivity of that labor. Remember, in slavery is an extreme form of monopsony, right? Where you, as the consumer, in this case, as the employer, extract the entire surplus from the labor force by paying them zero for their labor, when in fact, of course, their labor has a market value. So that's our concern, that the majority will create a monopsony or a monopoly of power and will extract rents from the minority. So how do we deal with this? We need counter-majoritarian institutions, right? That's why we need courts. That's why we need strong public opinion. That's why we need media. That's why we need a lot of counter-majoritarian institutions that actually will check the power of the majoritarian institution. In a more proportional system, this is less of a problem because you will have the different social groups having different power quotas depending on the seats they have in the parliament. But of course, the problem is to generate a stable government, because now, unless one party has an overall majority, but in the absence of an overall majority, you need a bargaining, you need coalitions. And so that's when you bring in game theory. We need some theory of coalition formation, how the different groups are going to form these coalitions. And so you see that the kind of institutions we need are sort of different. We are less concerned about counter-majoritarian institutions. We are more concerned with facilitating institutions, that is, institutions that facilitate government and facilitate this aggregation of preferences. Now, of course, it's all endogenous. And you know that the book gets into this, what they call the Duverger law. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. Maurice Duverger was a political scientist in France in the 1950s, 1960s, very famous. And he created this law, which of course it's not a law, it's sort of a overall conjecture that when you have a majoritarian system, you end up with two parties, because you end up with big coalitions trying to win the election. When you have proportional representation, you end up with a multi-party system, because the different social groups can unbundle. So in a majoritarian system, when you vote, you really vote for a much more abstract bundling of policies, because you vote for one party or the other, and they're very broad parties like the Republicans and the Democrats. All right, so if you know a little bit about US political history, it's not even clear why the right wing of the Democrats is actually that different from the left wing of the Republicans. I mean, they basically say the same thing. Of course, Trump has moved the Republican Party to the right, as Biden has moved a little bit the Democrats to the left. But if you look at people in the center, you don't really see where is the big difference, right? I mean, yes, the Republicans are pro-business and pro-market, but so were Clinton and the moderate Democrats. Yes, the Democrats are more concerned about minority rights, racism, LGBT agenda, abortion. But, you know, the Nixon Republicans were also part of that. In fact, as you know, civil rights were essentially part of a coalition between moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. In fact, the hardliner, the Democrats from the South, were the biggest enemies of the civil rights movement, not the Republicans. At least not the New York, Manhattan, sort of East Coast, Nixon, Rockefeller sort of Republicans. So it's very difficult to understand, you know, at least as me, as a European, when I come here, and it's like, what is this? Why are we so big on these two parties? Whereas if you go back to Europe, I mean, let's go to the UK, which I think most of you are quite familiar. I mean, the Tory party is still quite different from the Labour Party. I mean, people are saying now that, you know, with Tony Blair and the New Left and the Third Way, the differences disappeared. That's not true. I mean, Thatcher is quite different from, say, Harold Wilson or James Callaghan in the 1970s. And David Cameron is not the same thing as, you know, Corbyn in the Labour Party. And the Liberal Democrats, the third party, are also quite different. I mean, they're the only pro-European party, the only party that really wants to be UK in Europe. So there are significant differences. Now, that's what Duverger is telling us, is that when you go into proportional, a more parliamentary system, although the UK is not proportional representation, but it's a parliamentary system, you will get parties to be more narrow in their platforms, right? I mean, even in the UK, you have the Scottish National Party, you have the Welsh National Party, and you have the parties from Northern Ireland, all very local, all very narrow. You don't have the Californian Party or the Party of Texas or the Party of New York in the United States, because that would be a complete waste of votes, since we either get a Republican or a Democrat as president. So same goes into India. Of course, India has a significant number of parties. And of course, the parties are way more narrow in the sense of the platform. Although, to be honest, I'm not an expert on Indian politics. I always had some trouble, maybe later in the discussion you can explain me. I always had some trouble understanding exactly what is the platform of the Indian National Congress Party. That was always something I don't understand very well. Are they a left-wing party? Are they a right-wing party? Are they a centrist party? It was always a bit difficult for me to understand what sort of party they are. But it's a little bit like in South Africa. I mean, the African National Congress Party, the ANC, is also sort of difficult. I mean, it goes from a very left-wing, almost sort of communist wing, to some sort of moderate center-right, pro-market, pro-business wing. So it's very, sometimes as a foreigner, I don't really understand where these parties are, but I still would argue that they're sort of more narrow than what you have in the presidential system. Okay, so at this point, we have sort of moved to the last part of the chapter, which is how do we get to an equilibrium, right? So we have aggregated preferences. We have chosen a mechanism to aggregate preferences. How can we be sure we have an equilibrium? Well, this is back to your public choice. Many of you might even have seen this in the microeconomics class, which is called the Condorcet cycle. Have you seen the Condorcet cycle in your microeconomics? So remember, that's usually I don't know if you have covered that in microeconomics, but we usually use that to explain the impossibility theorem of Arrow. So the Condorcet is when you have three candidates and you have three votes. And the problem is, depending on how you vote them, pairwise, you end up with a different outcome, right? So suppose you had to choose between Trump, Biden, and Sanders. And one person prefers Trump, one voter prefers Biden, and one voter prefers Sanders. And the question is, who is going to win this election? Who is going to get two votes? The problem in the Condorcet literature is that depending on how we vote this, we're going to get a different outcome. If we do first Trump against Biden, then maybe Biden wins. And then if we do Biden against Sanders, again, Biden wins because he may get a vote from the Trump supporter. But if we do first Biden-Sanders, and for example, Sanders wins, and then we do Sanders-Trump, it could be that Trump wins. So depending on how we do this aggregation, we'll get different outcomes. So we get a cycle. Now, this is not good. This is not good because individual preferences are not like this, right? When you have to choose between coffee, tea, and water, only one of them will win because you're supposed to have transitive preferences. That's the whole reason why in your class, in your 101 microeconomics, on your second class, the professor explains you transitive preferences. Because if you have to choose out of 3 goods, one good must trump the others by transitivity and by completeness. When we get to aggregated preferences, if we get into the Condorcet cycle, we have a problem. And the problem is because these social preferences are not transitive. Why do we care about this in terms of constitutional law? Because now he's saying that whoever sets the agenda controls the outcome, right? If we have 3 goods, 3 candidates, each has 1 vote, and the only way to get an equilibrium is actually to do some pairwise voting, and we know the outcome depends on the specific path of the pairwise voting, that means whoever controls the job of deciding the voting will manipulate the outcome. That is one of the big issues in aggregation of preferences, and it's one of the big issues in government, is agenda setting. Whoever sets the agenda of the voting will inevitably change the result of the election. That's why, in very simplistic terms, it's very different when we have an election like in the United States, as you know, where you only vote once for president, compared to, say, the French system, or actually the Portuguese system, my native country, where we have 2 rounds, or like Brazil. We vote for the candidates, and then we have a second round with the 2 most voted candidates. That's agenda setting, because that changes how we pick the winner. So agenda setting is extremely important. A lot of what the Constitution does is agenda setting, is defining the rules that will allow outcomes. Now, why aren't we extremely concerned that whoever drafts the Constitution is manipulating outcomes, right? Because now we know some people will do agenda setting, and these are eventually the people who draft the Constitution. Why aren't we so concerned? That's when you come up with a different explanation, which is called the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, which some of you may have heard. The problem, so the theory is that when you're drafting the Constitution, when you're setting the agenda, you don't know if you're going to be part of the majority or part of the minority. You don't know if you're going to be part of the winning coalition or the losing coalition. That's behind the veil of ignorance. You don't know the future. So you don't know if in the future you're going to be a winner or a loser. So the theory is that that's why the Constitution will protect the rights of the minorities. That's why the Constitution will not give all power to the majority. Because if you give all power to the majority and you will be on the minority, you just did something very stupid. So the explanation why the agenda setting by the Constitution is not to give all power to the majority is because we don't know in the future who is the majority and who is the minority. In fact, Posner, in his book, goes further and uses this to explain why we decided to have independent courts, right? Because you can think, forget what you know about courts in India, just think, why do we want independent courts? Why would the politicians want independent courts? You're the government, you're running the country, you have a majority in the parliament. Why do you want your power constrained by the courts, right? Obviously, you don't want, as a politician, you don't want your power constrained by the courts. So Pose's explanation is politicians don't want independent courts. It's not of their interest to have independent courts. The issue is that when they designed the system, these same politicians did not know if they're going to be a majority or a minority, if they're going to be in government or if they're going to be in opposition. They likely know they're not going to be in government forever. And so when you are in opposition, you want the courts to protect you. So that's why you have constitutional protections for independent courts, because you, when you're in government, you don't like this, but when you're in opposition, you like this. And since you don't know if you're going to be in government forever, you have an incentive to sort of tolerate courts. Even you don't like that, of course. That's why we have a lot of crisis between executive power and judicial power. Executive powers don't like independent courts, obviously. They would like their laws to be constitutional all the time. After all, that's why they're in government. But the reason they tolerate this, the reason they submit themselves to the decisions of the courts, is because they think when I'm in opposition, I want the other side to submit to the decisions of the court also. And so it's sort of a repeat game. You need some of a repeat game interaction here. This leads us to another discussion, which we don't have time here, is why would authoritarian governments want courts, right? Because if the idea is you live in a competitive democracy, you don't know if you're government and opposition forever, that's why you want independent courts, then the question is, well, in a regime where you are in power forever, like in the Chinese regime, why do you want independent courts? In fact, they don't. That's why China largely does not have independent courts. Why would Putin want independent courts? Of course, Putin does not want independent courts. That's why the Russian courts are not very independent. But some countries have some sort of independent courts. And of course, you come up with other explanations. It's because of, foreign direct investment. So Hong Kong, for example, Singapore, they have reasonably independent courts to some degree. Why? Because they want to have business, they want to have private investment, they want to attract foreign direct investment. And so not all dictatorships or not all authoritarian, Singapore and Hong Kong are sort of more authoritarian, not really dictatorships. But, one-party systems may actually want some sort of independent courts for other reasons, not just to protect minority. Okay, so the last point I want to make before we go for questions is chapter 3 of the book, where it starts, talking about how we do bargaining, right? And here, I think we can bring in what we call the political cause theorem. Of course, Coase never wrote the political cause theorem. It's sort of a made-up name to sort of bring in the same intuition. Bargaining in democracy is a mechanism to address externalities, in particular, collective action problems. We need to coordinate behavior. We need to address these externalities. In order for this bargaining to work in a democracy, very much like the Coase theorem, we need majorly two things: low transaction costs, well-defined entitlements, right? Notice that unlike many economists, I don't like to use the expression property rights outside of property law, because I think that's very confusing when you're talking about politicians and you're talking about political bargaining to use property rights. I mean, what are the property rights? So I prefer to use entitlements, that people know their entitlements, right? And here's the big thing about constitutional law. The question you have to ask yourself is the Constitution reducing bargaining costs, reducing transaction costs? Is the Constitution being very clear about entitlements, right? Because that would be a successful Constitution. It's a Constitution that is very good at defining entitlements, and it's a very good at reducing transaction costs. Because then, within that framework, politicians, the political branches of government, should be able to negotiate an outcome to all these externalities. So why are some constitutions more successful than others? The explanation by economists would be because some constitutions were very well designed, were very well drafted in terms of being specific about entitlements and specific about transaction costs, and other constitutions were not. Is the American Constitution such an example? Well, it's a tricky question, because you could say, well, the Constitution of the United States has survived more than 250 years. So you could say it seems to be a quite successful constitution. But you could also say, yes, but there was a civil war. And if you have a civil war, that usually means the entitlements were not so clear and transaction costs were quite high, so high that we could not negotiate an outcome. We actually had to go to war to get one side imposing their version of the Constitution on the other side. So in terms of the American Constitution, it's not so clear that this is a very good example of a successful Constitution in terms of entitlements and in terms of transaction costs. So yes, that's a good question. I'm not sure you should characterize constitutional law as a zero-sum game, right? In fact, I would argue that the only way democracy survives, it's because it's a positive sum game. In fact, if you think of democracy as a zero-sum game, whatever the majority gets, the minority loses, and whatever the minority wins, the majority loses. I think we're going to have a very hard time with institutional stability, because essentially each side is going to try to be expropriating the other side, and I suspect you're going to end up in some sort of a conflict, right? I think that's, going back to the American example, I think that's why we had a civil war. It's because at some point, the North and the South, given their economic models, decided that this was a zero-sum game, that whatever the North was making was at the expense of the South, and whatever the South was making with slavery was at the expense of the North. And so we could not keep playing a repeat game. The only way out was, full-blown war. So I would argue that if you want to understand democratic institutions and democratic constitutions being successful, we should see democracy as a positive subgame. In fact, as a positive coordination game. That is, the problem we have is a bit like the Battle of the Sexes. We need to coordinate behaviors because the two Nash equilibria are either the majority wins or the minority wins. So we have two Nash equilibrium in pure strategies, but we need to coordinate this behavior in order to get a stable, some sort of evolutionary stable equilibrium. That would be my argument about trying to apply game theory to understand stable democracy. Okay, I think I'll open for a few more questions. So there are no more questions on the chat box right now. Yes, go ahead, Jatin.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So I wanted to ask, how does the concept of political agency costs apply to the behavior of elected representatives and government officials? And how can economic analysis help mitigate the agency problems, which are, I think, inherent in democratic setting of governance?
Yes, that's a good question. So I would start with the last part. I think you're absolutely right. And so whatever you're going to propose or think about, um, it won't be a magic solution. I don't think you can have a system where there's zero agency costs. So hopefully the first step is to accept that and understand that the goal is always to create an alternative where the agency costs are lower than what we have now. So that's a step into efficiency, but it won't be zero agency costs. So if any politician or any economist or any law professor comes to you and says, I'm going to give you a solution, a new system where we have zero agency costs, we know this person is lying because it does not exist. Now, let me get to the second point. First, we need to understand why we have these agency costs. In my view, it is quite different situations of moral hazard. That is, we just have bad incentives, right? I mean, shirking bureaucrats who do not do their job. This is just bad incentives. So we need to think about how to design better incentives. Let's be careful. Many people will say, oh, there's a very easy way to address shirking bureaucracies. We just tell them that we're going to pay you for performance. So let's go to the police and tell them, or the prosecutors, we will pay you for every conviction you get. You will pay you a percentage of the fine. Yes, but then we know the other side of this, which is going to be over incentives. People will start doing false positives because they want to have high rates of conviction, because they have to have many fines so to get more money. So let's be careful about incentives. They're tricky. We need to think about them. I can give you a very example. I was involved. At some point, some smart economists in Spain decided our judges are shirking. We need to incentivize judges by paying them for performance. So what they did was a percentage of the salary of the judges, depending on adjudication. What happened? An explosion of techniques to make up for adjudication, right? Very simple example. A divorce case. And one of the parties missed a paper. I don't know. I mean, I guess it could be the same in India. You need birth certificates, you need the marriage certificate, and you need some agreement, whatever. And they go and file for divorce. And one of them forgot the birth certificate. Before this reform, what would happen is the judge would tell the parties, you have 24 hours to come up with the missing documents, and then we'll proceed. After the reform, what they did was, oh, one paper is missing, denied, case closed, counts for my statistics as adjudication, and now let's open another case where you bring in the correct paperwork. So in reality, actually, it's worse. You have more bureaucracy now because you have two cases actually, rather than one case with a missing paper. But on the statistics, on the performance, it improved because these guys are adjudicating a lot of things, which are basically just cheap talk. So let's be careful about that. Moral hazard is a problem, but we have to think about incentivizing productivity the right way. If we do some quick, simple incentive, we might actually end up with a worse problem. So we might end up actually increasing agency costs rather than reducing agency costs. A different problem, in my view, is adverse selection. All right. So here's when people ask me, how can we fix corruption? Portugal is full of corrupted politicians. Why can't we? It's like, well, part of the issue is adverse selection, because people who are more inclined to engage in unethical behavior might also be more inclined to look for certain jobs. And politician is one of them, because politician could be an easy way to become rich without doing much. So if we have adverse selection, then the problem is sort of different. This is not about incentives. This is about recruitment. It's about selection. It's about getting the right people in the right place. And if this is what's going on, then we need to think about our recruitment mechanisms. How do people get to these jobs? Do we have transparent mechanisms of appointment? Do we know where these people are coming from? And so that's a different problem, right? That's a different nature of agency costs. So I think economics is useful, but I also think economists, we need to be very humble about coming up with solutions. I have seen lots of economists saying things like, I'm going to India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nepal with all these big policies, and we're going to solve the problem. And then you don't solve the problem because you don't know the underlying reasons of the problem. You don't know what's happening in these countries. You don't know the cultural context. And I mean, I honestly, I don't want to destroy our profession and say economists, we're just not good enough. But I don't think we cannot, we need institutional information. We need to look at the details before we understand where these agency costs are coming from. And that's where I think we should be looking at, rather than sort of, making big claims that if we do pay for performance, this is going to make the bureaucracies work very hard. Unclear, not always. Sorry, I don't know if I answered your question, but hope this is useful. More questions? Yes, please go ahead, Juanita.
Professor, do we have any tests on the veil of ignorance?
So I think you have two possible. One is I think most microeconomic books will have it when they explain what they call the Rawlsian objective function. But I think Varian, for example, has it in its textbook. But it's a very simplistic approach. I think you can find some of it here at Kutter-Newland at a more advanced level. But of course, in the limit, for anyone who really wants to know a lot about this, you have to unfortunately read Rawls yourself, which is not easy because he's a philosopher. But you have to read this. I think it's in the 1963 or the 1964 book where he explains all these ideas.
So what I was asking was that, I mean, it is a philosophical construct. It is applied in, the design of the Constitution, but does it exist? Is it true? You go back to the origins of the Constitution, and do we see, in a very concrete way, do we see its existence?
It's tricky, right? Because even if you compare the United States with the United Kingdom, the nature of their constitutions is very different. And so, whereas the US Constitution as a founding moment. And so it is possible that there was some ignorance of what was going to happen in the future. I mean, to a large extent, as you know, in the context of the United States, one of the big issues is why didn't the founding fathers address the problem of slavery in the most effective way in 1787? And of course, the answer is because they couldn't make an agreement on that. And so what they essentially did is a sort of a mixed solution, which was not really what both sides wanted. And to some extent, that leads them to a conflict for 100 years. The same thing in the US Constitution is, of course, the Title III courts. It's not clear what the founding fathers had in mind when they created the Supreme Court, right? I mean, as you know, the Supreme Court claims they have constitutional jurisdiction over laws. Later, in the early 19th century, in the Marbury case, was that what the founding fathers intended in 1787? And if that's what they intended, why didn't they write that in the Constitution? And so I think within the US context, there's a lot of discussion, the extent to which there was some ignorance and there was some decision to keep things sort of unclear because the different constituencies were ignorant or at least concerned about their position in the future. Now that is very different from the United Kingdom, because in the case of the United Kingdom, as you know, since they don't have a codified constitution, there's no actual founding moment. I mean, of course, the British will say it's the Magna Carta and 1215, but that's really a bit ridiculous to say that 1215 is the founding father of the Constitution, given, the significant differences between what they did in 1215 and what we have after the 18th century. I mean, there was no parliament in the 2015, and definitely there were no elections. So in the case of the UK, it's sort of hard to see where's the veil of ignorance operating, because in the case of the UK, in fact, what you have is a sort of an ongoing bargaining where the different constituencies keep bargaining for additional rents, additional power, and very often ending up in civil war because they cannot find a solution to their concerns. And so it's sort of less likely that we can use the veil of ignorance paradigm to understand the case of the United Kingdom. In the case of India, it's a little bit like the US. Of course, it's technically a founding moment because there's a moment where the constitution is drafted and enacted. But of course, a lot of the problems in India cannot be understood unless you also take the context of the post-colonial situation. That is, drafting the constitution in the 1940s and is not as if there was no background to that point. So is the veil of ignorance there, or was the veil of ignorance in the 19th century or the 18th century when the British took over the British Raj? So again, one thing is the abstract concept. A different thing is when you want to make an application to the case of a specific country. I don't want to sound like being very pessimistic. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. I don't think it's a very good explanation. I think politicians are usually more concerned about the short run than with the long term. I don't think the drafters of a constitution are that concerned about the long term. They're very concerned about short-term implications. And I do think, as in the United States, as in India, that the founding fathers, to a large extent, were responding to what they perceived as being the failures of the previous regime, that is, the colonial regime. What were the problems that, in their perception, were failures of the previous regime? If you look at the US Constitution, a large extent, they're trying to copy the British model, but adjust it for what they perceive to be the problems of the British model. Excessive powers of the king. So we need to constrain the powers of the president. A highly dysfunctional House of Commons. We need to have a functional House of Representatives. A highly privileged and detrimental House of Lords. We need to have a Senate that represents the interests of the states, but not in a privileged position to the point of threatening our democracy. So if you look at the United States Constitution, in a large extent, it's not will of ignorance, it's a response to what they perceive the problems in the past. So in a way, while the will of ignorance is about the future, my perception, my understanding is that a lot of the founding fathers are concerned about the past, and they're responding to the past. Like, why is that so many countries in Europe have constitutional courts? Why is that Germany decided to have a very strong constitutional court? It's not because of the future. It's because they did not want to repeat the Nazi regime. That is, that a strong dictator takes over the constitution and changes the constitution. How do we stop that? We create strong counter-majoritarian institutions. So that's why I'm not so convinced by the Rawls veiling of ignorance, because I think a lot of constitutional drafting is more about the past, perceptions about the past, trying to correct what went wrong in the past, rather than predicting the future and how the politicians are going to behave in the future. Sorry, Renita, for sort of a detour here, but I do not want to sound like I'm being very biased in this conversation.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, how does risk aversion and uncertainty factor into the economic analysis of democratic decision making, especially when considering long-term policy impacts and potential unintended consequences?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one question that's really a big issue in public choice and in political science is, are the politicians more or less risk averse than the median citizen? And this is a different issue. I mean, it goes back to your original question of agency costs, because that's a different sort of agency costs, which goes into the point you're making now. If the politicians have the same degree of risk aversion than the population, then the policies they're going to enact will deal with uncertainty and unintended consequences much the way the community wants. Of course, we live in a world with uncertainty. There's no way we can deny that. And of course, there are unintended consequences, like, climate policies, human rights policies. All of those may have unintended consequences. If the politicians really have the same sort of risk behavior that, the median voters, median citizens, I don't think this is a big problem. The problem is if we think, and I think maybe there's good reasons to say that, the politicians are less risk averse than the median voters. Why? Because being a politician is a highly risky job. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes you have to take extreme measures to win an election. Sometimes you have to take extreme policies to persuade the voters. So it could be that we do have a selection problem, that people who become politicians are more risk lover than the medium citizen. If that's true, then we have a problem, because the policies they're going to enact are policies that are riskier than they should be, and are policies that neglect unintended consequences more often than they should. And so that's a big issue. Again, as I said, there's no consensus in the literature. Some people think the politicians are as risk averse as most people. Some people think that politicians tend to be more risk loving than the median voter. That's an interesting area for research. Of course, it's difficult. You can't just go to politicians and ask them, are you risk averse? Are you risk neutral? What's your risk? I mean, that's not how it works. So we need to think of how we test this, how we can actually sort of find some, revealed preference, a mechanism to try to see if that's what's going on. But I think this is a big issue. And as you're saying, if it's indeed the case, then that's another agency cost problem that we need to be very careful about. So I have to go in about 5-7 minutes. So if you have more questions.
Professor, yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Ma'am, you go. Ma'am, sir, I was asking, you asked the question, why we do go to vote? The point is the perception of value of vote is more than the value of vote that drives the person to go to vote.
Right. So I think there's several issues there. One is it is possible that a lot of people think that their vote is more important than it is. That's possible. I mean, it is possible that people do not understand. Not outside of economists and mathematicians, science people, not everyone thinks in terms of probabilities. So it could be that people do not think in terms of probabilities. They don't understand probabilities. So that's one possible. So in that respect, voting would be an example of bounded rationality, where people are not doing a rational calculation in the way they do it. Another problem is, as you're saying, it's perceptions, that people have perceptions that may or may not be well grounded in reality. And that's where the example of Switzerland comes in. That is, it could be, I'm talking about, the previous question about unintended consequences. It could be that when you change the way you vote, you actually change perceptions. And as you change perceptions, people actually might vote less when you were expecting people to vote more. And so another issue, which I did not mention, I think it's a big issue now in Europe, in the United States. I don't know if it's being issue in India. It's the role of opinion polls before the election. Opinion polls are used to persuade people to go and vote for this or the other. That's not what an opinion poll is about. The opinion poll is supposed to be sort of a static picture of what people think in a moment of time. The fact is, now opinion polls are being used as building up perceptions, right? So if I see my candidate is almost winning, then okay, I have to go to vote because we are almost winning. But if I see my candidate is already 20% ahead, I don't need to vote because my candidate is going to win anyway. The problem, why is this happening? Because in a way, voting is a collective action problem. I don't know what other people are thinking. And my vote, in a way, depends on what other people are thinking. Now, opinion polls seem to give me that information. They tell me what other people are thinking in aggregate, and that changes my behavior. Now, notice how this is simply another way of updating your information. You're updating your information, and because you're updating your information, you're changing your behavior. So I think this is complicated, and I think if you try to understand voting behavior, you're going to have to understand why different types of people end up voting and why they show up or not show up in the ballot box. Particular in the US, we're going through a moment of polarization. And so the polarization, unfortunately, is seen as another mechanism to make people go to vote. And that fits into the polarization, because the more you polarize, the more you think people are going to vote. And if people vote as a response to polarization, you polarize more, which ends up creating high transaction costs in terms of, after the election, finding a stable government. So I think there are a lot of things coming in. I do think that the old rational explanation of looking at, benefits and costs is not going to go as very far in this area. Sorry, I hope I answered your question. Long answer.
Professor, since the time constraint doesn't allow us to
Yes.
continue, I'll just, on behalf of all the participants of this particular course, thank you for your very extended sessions. Almost 12 hours you spent with us, and you've covered a very significant and very important areas of literature, both in economics of crime and economics of constitution. I don't know whether we have a word with higher value additions. Then thank you. Very limited, we only know that, so I'll extend that.
Thank you so much.
It's
been a pleasure.
And Professor, can I take a minute or so, just maybe, ask some participants to maybe, conclude with a vote of thanks? I don't know, I'm just picking randomly. Dr. Rohtash, would you like to share some of your thoughts with us about Sir's contributions?
Good evening, ma'am. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, your lecture was very, very important to me, sir. It's very knowledgeable to me. Sir, I am ma'am, Renita ma'am. I completed my master's in economics and I completed my master's in law also. And I completed my PhD on the topic of distributive justice. So my topic is blend of constitutional law, economics, and jurisprudence. Sir, actually, Renita ma'am, the department of the Center for Law and Economics in in Gujarat National Law University is very important institute in India for the purpose of the study or blending these two subjects, law and economics. I am very, very thanks to you, ma'am, Renita ma'am. I visited in the March GNLU. I presented my paper in that workshop. Actually, ma'am, your institution is the leading institution in India on the topic of law and economics. And sir, your view give me an idea and direction that I can now onwards, I can think in such a dimension, in that dimension after listening you, sir. So ma'am, thank you so much for providing this opportunity to me, and thank you so much, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
All right, Dr. Rohtash, sir, you don't have time. We would have taken otherwise, inputs from all participants. It would be, I think, another 3 hours, But some other seminar just for, what participants, both faculties and students, feel about your very valuable session. You'll have us give us time for that. We'll have to allot, or maybe we can write up and send it to you.
Yes, I was going to suggest it because I really need to go. So my suggestion would be, if anyone needs some help or some advising with reading or additional materials or anything, please do email me. Renita knows that I'm usually quite fast with responding emails. I am not a lazy person, so usually takes a very quick response. So of course there's time difference, so don't expect that I'll be responding in the middle of the night. But I usually take about 1 day to respond. So I may need to think a little bit about, if you ask me for references, I may need to think a little bit about appropriate references. But please do not hesitate to contact me if you want some references or some readings for whatever research projects you're doing in these areas. And I'm afraid I really need to go because I'm 2 minutes away from my other conference call. So I apologize for that.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. On a serious note, participants, good evening, everybody. As you know, as a part of certification process, we require you to send in your extended abstracts or reflective notes by today. We have not mentioned the timeline. The whole night is up to 12 o'clock is yours. It should not become 11th of August. Within 10th, please submit your either reflective notes or extended abstract. Thank you so much for being a part of the course. We hope to continue the association, as you know, and thank you, Dr. Rohtash, for kind of giving so much of recognition. But it's been a collective work. I have to mention Dr. Hitesh Thakkar,
Yes.
who has actually, kept this all together and going. I thank, Ayush, our center assistant, who has completely been so punctual and very, very concerned and very, very professional about the course. Student members, Sarang, Khyati, where are you? All credit to you. And I'm sorry if I missed out anybody. My very, very, very dear faculty friends, Gitanjali, Brinpit Madam, Namita Madam, Seema Ma'am, and I'm sorry if I'm missing anybody else. Everybody, huge thank you for being with us for 12 extended hours.
Can we have a
Thank you so much, ma'am.
I look forward to your submissions and continuous association. Yes, Ayush, you say something.
Ma'am, I'm saying that can we have a photo? If I request everyone to open
Ab
their
kya photo? I had told you photo with professor. Ab kya? I had said let's have a photo with professor and then we can send it to him.
Yeah, but ma'am, sir was so.
Sir to gaye.
Yeah.
I wish. Abhi I was okay. Chalo theek hai. We'll have a photograph. We'll call him in our next conference and then
Yeah,
we'll have a
in the international conference we can
offline
talk.
photograph. Okay? Does that work?
Yes, ma'am.
Chalo guys, thank you.
Bye, ma'am. Thank you
Good
so
night.
much.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for all
Welcome.
the sessions.
I have only received 9
Thank you, ma'am.
abstracts. I request everyone to send by night today.
Bye
Awesome.
tonight.
Bye
Excuse
bye.
me.
Bye bye. Good night. Thank you.
Bye. Good night, ma'am.
Hello.
Excuse me, I just wanted to know the word limit of the abstract.
Around
It-
1500 words.
It's
How
already
much was
mentioned
it?
in the form 500 words.
500 words.
How much?
Ma'am, can you please clarify what exactly are you going to be looking for in the abstracts?
That is written in email.
Just the broad theme of the conference, right?
Yeah, yeah. On the
No,
conference.
no. What are you asking about? Are you asking about the reflective note or the abstract?
Abstract, ma'am.
So the abstract cannot be a broad, write-up of the conference. An abstract is this. Listen, an abstract is take any concept that you've been taught. It could be from crime, it could be from constitution, any aspect of that, and you would want to kind of relate it to an Indian position in law, criminal law or constitutional law, isn't it?
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, actually, I've
Identify.
never made a abstract before, that's why.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually not made an abstract before, that's why I was asking.
That's all right. So, but do only this much. You're from which year?
Ma'am, I
Advitya?
just completed my second year, I've just entered third year.
ठीक है. So you have that much of a background in law. All you have
Yes,
to
ma'am.
do is take a economic principle, associate it with a, you know, with some question that is concerning you, you know,
Okay, ma'am, got it.
you know, and then kind of, you know, tell us about tell us about what the problem is, how do you use the economic conceptual framework, and what are the solutions that you can give.
Okay, ma'am.
So
Thank you,
something
ma'am.
like that. Okay, chalo. Thank you everybody. Good night. Jutan, you are from where?
Ma'am, I'm from Gujarat only, but I'm studying in Bangalore in Christ University. I'm in my second year.
Which area? I mean, what are you studying? Law?
Yeah, I'm studying law only. 5 years integrated. I mean, I'm in my second year.
All right. Christ University, right?
Yes, Christ Central Campus.
Okay. Chalo. First time you've been with us in our program?
Yes, I have for the first time.
I'm sure we'll see more of you.
Yeah, 100%, ma'am.
We
I can
have
assure you that.
conferences and all of that, you know.
Yeah, I can assure you that.
Chalo. Okay. On that note, thank you and good night.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ayush.
Thank you.